All right. Thank you for letting me know. Good to see a handful of faces here. We may have some others pop in and out over the course of this evening, but let me just kick us off and get us started as the music fades. So thanks for joining us here for another Fireside Chat. My name is Jake Tuber, CEO of Endeavor Run. I'm going to be playing the host role for most of tonight. I will share a couple thoughts if pertinent, but hopefully we can hear mostly from our guest of honor this evening, a man who needs no introduction, certainly with this crowd, and thus he won't get one. But here's Matt Fitzgerald. Matt, my buddy, good to see you again. And we got another couple of Endeavor Run coaches with us. Bertrand Newson, Peter Bromka, one of our coach athletes, is with us tonight, so we can pick on them a little bit as well. The topic for tonight's discussion, for those of you who are watching it live, feel free to chime in over the chat, by the way, with questions, comments along the way. You can unmute yourself to just talk over us. That's fine. That's part of why we use this particular software. Feel free also to use the hand raise. Anything you want to get our attention, if you want to chime in either with a question or a comment, if something's resonating, something you want to follow up. Because the main goal for our topic tonight, which is planning your year, or thinking about how to, or if you ought to plan your year. Our main goal for tonight in addressing this topic is our goal for all of our fireside chats we've done in the past, and will always be something central to Endeavor Run, which is distilling wisdom and expertise from the folks most equipped to give it, but in a way that actually benefits you, ideally starting right after this, starting as soon as we're done and moving forward. One of our mantras with Endeavor Run is this notion of, if it doesn't inspire any change from what you were doing before you arrived here, it wasn't that useful. And sometimes that change could be a new approach, new behavior, new pattern. Sometimes it could just be the reassurance that what you were doing is in fact worth staying the course on as well. That's fair. But we feel like we're wasting your time if you're not being able to take this interesting information and apply it to your goals yourself as an athlete and runner. Otherwise, it's essentially a podcast, and podcasts are awesome and they have a great purpose. But one of the beauties of being able to do this somewhat live, for those of you who are joining us in this format, is that there's the potential to really take it from there. So we're going to really try to drill down. The topic, of course, is planning your athletic year. We had a couple of main questions and some others that were written into us, and we'll start off right. It's just about the turn of the new year as we have this chat tonight. Matt, what is your advice to our first main question that's posed to you tonight on whether or not an athlete should plan out the entirety of their year from the start? If you were coaching someone, would you say, what's your plan for all of 2022? Or would you take it more piecemeal? Weigh in on that for us right as we get going.
Yes, I get tired of saying it depends, but the answer, the short answer to so many questions of this sort is it depends. To expand on that, I will say that if you are a less experienced runner, beginner to, just like sufficiently inexperienced that you don't have a lot of confidence around like doing your own planning, then you should plan. Winging it is a legitimate alternative, but that only works if you're experienced and confident and know what you're doing. So yeah, for those who are toward the beginner end of the spectrum, and you can sort of self-designate, it really is it's more like how you feel about your confidence level in planning. Then you should skew toward planning. If you are a planner by nature, then go ahead. Like, you should not feel, if my answer to the question were, oh, you should not plan, and you are the kind of person who just needs to plan to not go nuts, then you should ignore what I'm saying, because like that's going against your nature. And there are definitely different types in that regard. There are the intuitive folks who just, they prefer to go by the seat of their pants and they can make it work. And then there are the folks who just need to know, basically what they're going to be doing a month from now, 3 months from now, and so on. So, go with your preferred style, whatever's comfortable in that regard. And that would cross cut against, experience levels. And then a third consideration would be, how exactly what you're planning to do next year. Like, for me, for example, in 2018, I decided to come out of triathlon retirement and do my first Ironman triathlon in like 17 years. And at that time, like I hadn't been swimming at all. and I had a history of getting knee problems if I did any amount of cycling. So I signed up for a race, an Ironman race that was 11 months later, because I knew I needed that time. So even though I actually am kind of a more intuitive, seat of the pants, winging it type of person, because I knew I was woefully unprepared for the challenge I wanted to take on, I did give myself a lot of time, and I did sort of like do more planning than I want to do. So that's another consideration. If you're, just as an example, if you're planning to do your first ultra marathon, and maybe you're coming off an injury, or you've just been struggling with motivation, or you've indulged in the holidays, and you're nowhere near ready to toe the start line of an ultra marathon, then that would move you in the direction of more planning. So those are three considerations, and then the fourth I would toss in as a kind of wild card would be the pandemic. That makes it, we're heading toward the start of year 3. It makes it like harder to plan, but also in a sense more important to plan when you can, with that wild card at play. So now I have 4 factors for you to consider, and we should have.
Well, I'll throw some more wrenches in that, Matt, but hopefully this will give folks more options. The idea is that you have to consider all of these at once, but really think about the kind of runner you are and your goals. But it sounds like one of the things that you mentioned when you thought about yourself planning for that triathlon you hadn't done in a while is the Ironman. You gave yourself 11 months notice. For you, that's big. That's different. That's not your style. If someone has something that seems like that's really new and different, or a bit of an outlier as far as things they're used to, if you've got your first ultra, if you've got a big marathon and you've been running 5Ks, if you're doing something radically different for you, it sounds like planning is probably something that, even if it's not your personality, you're going to get more out of, just because you're going to need to plan for that a little bit more, especially around the pandemic. At the same time, though, there's obviously case in point to be made. My understanding from a lot of the pro athletes that I talk to, or we work with through Endeavor Run in various capacities, is that your longer distance runners generally have a couple of events planned that they know about, at least roughly speaking, at this point in the year. And Peter, maybe I can ask you to talk either a little bit about your experience or some of the other elites and pros that you run with, but they kind of say, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this. Maybe I'm doing Boston in the spring, and then I'm looking at, something potentially midsummer that's a half marathon, and then either Chicago or New York. I haven't decided which, but they're thinking about it in that chunks. Does that resonate with you, Peter? I mean, I know you've got something in mind for the spring and the fall. That's a pretty good degree of planning for somebody that you personally, I know, is pretty good at going with the flow in terms of your general personality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. We keep coming back to knowing what works.
You on hold with a pizza place or something there? What
sorry, I had to call someone. Okay. So I've been on hold for an hour. I thought I could get it done. I think it's worth noting that part of this process is understanding yourself and what you need. So I think every year, the last 3 years, have laid out on an Excel Google sheet the broad strokes of the entire year. And I tend to fill in what the sort of the wave of weekly mileage might look like. And I've sent it to teammates before, and they've said, whoa, you could definitely hurt yourself if you did this. And I was like, oh, I would never probably end up doing all of this. It would be sort of, that's all with the caveat of you need to listen to your body. And the way I've trained is much more ebb and flow. Some people are much more dialed in. And so you have to know what works for you. But yeah, I think it sounds like a lot to say I'm going to run the Grand Marathon in 6 months. But when I have backed out of it and said, what fitness do I need to be in to even prepare that block? And then do I want some downtime coming out of that, building that fitness? So yeah, just to speak to myself, I have basically a few months of building up, then a little bit of a 2-week vacation, and then that'll be about a 12-week build. And pretty soon you're looking at 5.5 months. And it's wow, that can come quickly, but that's all. So it feels stressful, but because I'm planning from so far out, it's oh, there's plenty of time to get sick and bounce back. And, not each of those weeks need to go perfectly.
So give yourself a little bit of slack within that. And I think that's probably true for you as an elite marathoner. This was a question that I know, Matt, we talked about teeing up, and it actually is really nicely reflects in a question that Angie wrote in today, which was in particular, her question was, if she has a goal marathon in October, what should you focus on at sort of the various points from now until then? And I think there's a sort of larger question in that, which is sort of our second main question tonight, which is, if you're looking at your year, and most of us are thinking about one or two key events where we may really want to be primed, how should you think about planning a year if you have 1 to 3 events that you want to do, assuming they're appropriately spaced out and they're not, just back to back, 100-meter dashes or something where, everything's fine. But if you're an endurance runner, how should you think about structuring a year if your goal was to sort of optimize for a few key performances, Matt?
Yeah, when we spoke this morning, we talked about what I perceive as a common problem of over racing among, recreational runners. And I get it, like that's why we train, is to race. But racing really is the enemy of training. So you kind of have you can either race a lot or you can race well. It's like you pick. And if you choose to race a lot with open eyes, knowing that you'll never race as well by racing that often, that's all right. But you should just know, what you're sacrificing. So, yeah, to your point of 100-meter dash, it's like, even if you're like a 5K kind of person, you can race a lot more. You can peak a lot more for that distance than you can for longer distances. So, the longer the distances you tend to specialize in, the fewer opportunities, or the fewer opportunities you should plan to be at peak fitness. So it's just a matter of like a little bit of self-awareness in that regard. Like exactly like, that's why we have this, the concept of tiered A, B, and C races. An A race is a race where you want to be at your absolute best. And that requires, a long, steady, progressive block of training, and then culminating in, a short period of functional overreaching, followed by a taper, followed by a race, and then some downtime. Because it's not just the race, it's the training itself that leaves you needing a break. And so you can only milk one training progression for at most 2 peak races. So, if you have a little bit of experience and you maybe like you're durable and you tend to recover well, you might be able to do, and you see pros doing this more and more lately. It's like maybe 2 marathons in 7 weeks, and you're doing that off of one base. So you go through an entire block, run a marathon, recover, and then do kind of a little progressed mini cycle, peak again, but you're going to definitely need a proper break after that. So yeah, the longer your races, the more, the fewer peaks you should plan. B races and C races are okay. But, C races definitely should be considered basically, just hard workouts with a number pinned on your bib. They should be fit into the training process in a way that is minimally disruptive, because again, races are the enemy of training. So yeah, that's how I would approach it. Just, be cognizant of just, how tempting it is and how common it is to over race. And again, if you want to put in performances that you feel truly represent the limit of your potential, then be selective, choose a few opportunities. And it's not like it has to be all one or all the other. Like I myself, though I always preferred to race at my best, I went through periods where I intentionally, knowingly over raced. And so it was like a phase. So you can do both, but you want to just kind of compartmentalize and know which phase you're in.
Matt, would it be fair to sum up a little bit of that and tell me if this phrase is an accurate representation of, if your distances are over, let's say 10K, right? You're looking at 10 miles or higher for most races. Generally speaking, you can either race frequently for fun, or you can race infrequently if your goal is to absolute max your performance. And is that a fair way to think of it? Is that, not that there's a pure cutoff at the 6.4 mile mark, but in general, as far as most races that are on the calendar, you could probably squeeze in a couple of 10Ks and have a nice kind of extended peak. But at race distances longer than that, it's it's pretty rare. There are, to your point, I mean, Peter, I know you ran CIM and then a couple months later came back and ran Houston on the same relative base and ran 219 both times, which is absurd. So it's doable, but there's a lot of years of fitness that went in before that, I suppose.
I think 10 miles is kind of that feels about right. Semi-arbitrary, but it's going to be somewhere around there. It's fluid.
that makes sense. And again, right, even the best 100-meter dash athletes in the world, they can do pretty well more frequently, but they're still periodized, right, if they want to peak for the US finals or the Olympics or something like that. So even at really short distances, yeah, you can run a lot more like 9.98s if you're world class, but if you want to run 9.7, you got to be usually a little bit more selective. Maybe the 100's a bad example because the start is so dependent on that outcome, but shorter distances is fair. One other way to think about it in terms of A, B, and C, in terms of what you care about, that I've been kind of experimenting with in helping athletes a little bit, is thinking about if your goal is one or two specific performances. If you're like, I want to crush a fast time and I don't know which race I'm going to pick next fall, but I know I want to do one, or I really want to run Boston. I often think about sort of, especially at distances around the marathon, goals of either completing the race, running the race, or racing the race. And if you want to race the race, that's sort of like a ABC or CBA approach to doing it. But if you want to race a race, if there's things where you really want to be at the best you could be at that time, given where you are in your life, start your annual planning by putting those things on the calendar. And then make the decision, am I going to go for those at all costs? Because if so, you really don't want to have B and C races that are on the calendar, maybe at all, maybe as tactical, very strategic buildups. But that when you're sacrificing those things, it's because crushing those A races is super important to you. If you say, those are my things that I'm really focused on: Chicago next year, Boston, CIM next year, grandmas. If those are the things on your calendar, but you're like, you know what, I want to have a little bit more fun or try some new things too. So if I'm at 96% as opposed to 100% for that, I'll be fine with it. Then you can add on a little bit more. But I think it's about taking the couple things that you absolutely know you want to do, putting them on your calendar now, and then deciding before you put anything else on the calendar, how much do I want to be all in on those versus mostly in on those versus just completing those. And that will give you a little bit of a range as to how to pack in a schedule ahead of time. So that's another way to think about it. And Matt, one thing that you and I have been talking about a lot in sort of coaching athletes and the psychology of it is the experience of the mental benefits of putting yourself out of your comfort zone in your training to impact your racing and reflecting on that. And so one of the things that I would potentially encourage those listening to this to do is, when it comes to planning in general, if you're not a planner, see what it's like to try to plan it out and reflect on the experience of having to stick to it, or you're wanting to abandon it, and what's behind that. What might be driving that? Why is it difficult for you? What is it kind of causing internally? That's a bit of a challenge. Alternatively, if you're a hyper planner, what would it look like to maybe have one race on your calendar for all of next year, and every couple of weeks see how your fitness is and see what your friends are doing and be a little bit more intuitive? You may decide that playing with these variables right now, just given where you are in your life and your running goals, as far as that's concerned, this isn't the time or place to do that. I'd argue that because COVID's throwing everything off, there's no better time than to kind of mess with it, because the world's going to mess with you a little bit anyway. But I think that yourself as a planner and how much you adjust to that at this point with the new year coming up, that can be a really interesting learning experience. The actual designation of do I plan or not, in as much as the actual training experience can be. So I don't know if Matt or Coach B, if you have any thoughts on that, certainly would love to hear from you as well, in terms of utilizing planning capability. Sorry, Peter, is the person off hold yet? Can we talk to them, or no? Are you on the phone with the bank? I'm guessing you're on the phone with the bank.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to build on your idea.
All right, we'll go to you and then over to Coach B.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's perfect.
I, again, not being a planner, have realized looking back that I love to do things based on the enthusiasm of others and teammates and friends. And so that can lead me to doing the thing, in the short term that I get invited to do. And so part of planning out the year even a 2-year cycle has been to say, well, I have these goals, like these states I want to go to, these events I'd like to do. And if you start to add them up, you go, wow, like could be a bunch of weekends. This guy's invited me to Austin in February. Got to put that on the list. And pretty soon I realized, I'm going to ask my family to be away, a handful of weekends. It's helped me prioritize and say, if I really want to do these 5 things, that's already over a month. I'm planning of weekends. I'm planning to be away, and it's helped me deprioritize things that I know people will ask me about, and I don't really have a great reason not to go. Like, it's a totally worthwhile event, but it has made it much easier to say, like, no, I'm not doing that this year. So just some thoughts.
That's super cool. Coach P.
Thanks for the opportunity, JT. I'm in the midst of these conversations. I mean, it seems like for the last 2 weeks as we're heading into 2022, conversations today, conversations yesterday, people wrapping up 2021, asking questions like, what is your annual mileage been for 19, 20, and 21? And then what is that goal for 2022? And then again, what is your A race at whatever your sweet spot distance is? Many people are focusing on the half marathon and marathon distance. And when you start putting those desired race dates on the calendar, there's a reality that settles in, and you can't be all places at all times logistically, and then from a peak fitness standpoint. So having the athlete really realize that you can't do 15 races and expect to PR all 15 races in reality, especially with the buildup. And for me, it's been very helpful in planning out at least 4 to 6 months with my athletes. That seems to be a good sweet spot. It's very rare that we've built out an entire calendar year, and really centered around if there was one race you can do this year, making sure that we have a tight training block that is effective, that works around their life schedule as well. So it's a work in progress, but again, where I've seen the most aha moments in the last 2 weeks with my athletes as we're looking at the first half of 2022 or the first quarter, first 4 months, is you can't plan on having peak performance at multiple distances at multiple live racing events. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Unless your name is Kate Grace and you run the half mile in the year 2021, you can't expect PRs every single week and get faster and faster. But there's a reason there's just few of them. That's really insightful, and I think builds on that. So, I'd say, again, at the risk of over condensing a little bit of what we talked about in terms of planning out your year, I would say there's a couple things that I think are really sticking out, and Matt, Coach B, Peter, others definitely add to the list that we're building here. But one, you should decide for you what kind of year you want to have. If there's a couple of events you really want to crush, start with those and then build around that. If there's a couple of seasons you want to have more generally, that's fine. Don't expect successive PRs, right? You're going to be running a lot of those as opposed to racing them for PRs. Trying to play with adjusting your planning as far as a variable that gives you an opportunity to learn a little bit about you as a runner is a cool way to adjust for that. And again, you have a little bit more flexibility if your race distances are, 5K, 10K or shorter, because you can have an extended season where, you can be in peak shape, Matt. What do you think, for 6 weeks or so running 5Ks? And that could be a relative peak plateau that's not out of the question. But again, look to what the pros do, right? If they're really trying to crush a performance or two, the general theory is always like a spring marathon and a fall marathon. And maybe, somewhere in the buildup or somewhere riding the tail end of a base like that is a half marathon. Perfect example is our athlete and dear friend, Kira D'Amato, who everyone's story everyone knows now. Kira, crushed a spring marathon, was injured, spent the summer kind of revamping, getting healthy, thanks to our friends at Inside Tracker in many ways, got her kind of healthy with some blood data there. Came out, ran 4th place at Chicago a couple months ago, kind of recycled-ish to get ready to peak for the U.S. Half Marathon Championships, which she won about 2 weeks ago, and then is running the Houston Marathon at the tail end of that second peak, and then is taking a bunch of time off. So 2 major races, a couple others. She'll probably end up making the World Half Marathon team. I'm guessing they'll ask her to do that in the spring, but very few events if your goal is to absolutely peak. If your goal is to just be kind of in the hunt, you get a little bit more leeway. A question to kind of ride on the back of that, Matt, is a little bit about your training up and through. And Veronica had a question that she shared with us on Instagram and just reaffirmed. Coming back from injury, right? If you're picking up your training again and doing a little bit of planning, is it better to do, if you're, let's say, running only a few times per week, long and slow, purely aerobic if you're running 3 times a week? Or if you're only down to 3 times, should those be harder tempo, little bouts of speed play, fartlek, stuff like that? I guess if you're coming back from injury, assuming you're healthy enough, but you can only run a couple days a week, are you going to get more benefit if you're restricted to just a few days running of making those kind of zone 3, zone 4 days, or just keeping those, long, slow distance zone 1 days, Matt?
Once again, depends on a few things. If assuming that you are fully healthy and it's not risky to run faster, and that's not a limiter, then you have the option to introduce small doses of faster running. But if you haven't been doing, if you've had an interruption, an injury-induced interruption to training, and you haven't done, let alone any running, let alone faster running, then you don't want to go straight to that. I would take at least 2-3 weeks to get your feet back under you, just get into a groove. And then, if you feel good and you're motivated, yes, you will make faster progress. The old base training, the traditional, the classic Lydiard style base training was all easy running, but that's sort of gone the way of the dodo bird. And now it's recognized that you'll simply make faster progress. It's not like you have to, go straight from all easy running to, gut busting track workouts. In fact, you shouldn't. You can do, the great thing about high intensity is that a very little bit goes a long way. So yeah, if you're feeling healthy and the motivation is there and you want to accelerate your progress, I like to have people go from maybe 2-3 weeks of all easy running, and then do a week where one run is a fartlek, or just with some, a few scattered short pickups. It might not feel like a lot, like maybe 8 times 20 seconds or 8 times 40 seconds, whatever, at 5K pace, something like that, just sprinkled throughout an otherwise easy run. But that starts the process right there. I mean, it's better than nothing. And then maybe another run where the way I like to introduce moderate intensity is usually with a fast finish type of run. So you could do, 40 minutes at low intensity and finish with 5 minutes at, 10K pace, or, your threshold pace. So you're just like reintroducing, there are times when you're just like, you're not necessarily in the mood, like your fitness is low, and you don't want to just like, you're not just ready to suffer yet at all. Then it's fine actually to go, many weeks, string together a lot of weeks of just increasing volume. A little bit of high intensity goes a long way, but low intensity is the gift that keeps on giving. So you can enjoy the process of getting fitter and fitter and fitter by doing more and more and more low intensity training. Again, getting back to your question, if it's just 3 runs per week, then that would steer me a little bit toward introducing the fartlek type of stuff and the fast finish type of stuff a little bit sooner.
As someone who has been trying unsuccessfully to come back from injury for over 2 years now,
River.
Matt, I have, and I will continue to do so, but not in front of everyone else. Thank you. One of the things that I can definitely recommend to piggyback on what Matt said is the fast finish run is something you can decide to do in the moment. And especially coming back from injury, those days where like you're on an easy run and you just feel okay and you're like, I kind of want to open it up, and you can always slow it back down, right? But it's a little bit different if I'm planning to like, do mile repeats on the track and I go and warm up and I'm just not feeling it. It's a little harder to pivot to then an aerobic day. Maybe I don't even have the right shoes or something. So I really like the fast finish is something that, generally speaking, if you're running 3 times a week, you could decide at any given week to make any one of those a fast finish run for the last 5-10 minutes of your run or something like that, and wouldn't hurt you And that, obviously you should veto this if your training philosophy or research disagrees, but I also think one of the real secrets, if you're building in high intensity, especially after injury, but in general, but especially after injury, hills are fantastic because you can get a lot of musculoskeletal benefit putting less stress on your body, because fundamentally a hill is basically, it's forcing your body to kind of sprint, right? As long as you're not just shuffling up it. And because of the distance between your lead foot and the hill is lower than your lead foot and the ground when you're running flat, you're just exerting less force into the pavement on your muscles, on your joints, et cetera, while you're doing that. So coming back, if you're trying to get in high intensity stuff to build back, especially after injury or when your body's a little bit broken down, hill repeats. Sometimes I'll do short, sharp hills for 18 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds, pretty darn hard, just really focused on form. Long, slower hills, again, it's not meant to be sort of an aerobic kind of marathon style, long, super slow, get to the rail kind of hill, but short, sort of high intensity hills can be a great way to build back in high intensity work for me anyway, after injury, because you're going to get sprint benefits and high intensity benefits with a little bit less strain. Obviously it's mentally challenging in a different way, and that can be good or bad, but man, I don't know if you disagree with that. I saw you nodding, so I'm going to take that as an agreement there.
Yeah, I almost went there and tossed in a reference to hills. Yes. The exception would be like certain injuries, like if you're coming off an Achilles thing, then not so much. But yeah, in most cases, yes.
Yeah, ankle stuff is bad for sure around that. That makes sense. Now, I had another question from somebody that submitted a question on Instagram earlier today that I think is appropriate to ask now. Can you just remind folks how to make adjustments to their training zones for cross training? So are your heart rates the same in zone 1 if you're running as they are if you're cycling, ellipticaling, swimming, doing other things? For those who are trying to build in more cross training this year as they're planning, what should they think about in terms of adjusting their relative sort of zones for training?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest, like quick and dirty way to translate is with perceived effort. So like, they say, science says that anything below a 4 out of 10 counts as low intensity, as long as your RPE is appropriately calibrated. So like, an easy run should be at any given time in an easy run, you should be able to say, my RPE is, 4 out of 10 or less. And so most runners, when they are cross training, they're cross training at low intensity. So if you don't want to go through the bother of, testing or whatever, you can use that same standard will translate. If you want to be, just more, technical and dialed in, unfortunately, heart rate is the best. Heart rate does travel, but you do have actually, different zones. It's relative, not absolute. So, if the upper limit of your low intensity heart rate is, let's just say 140 beats per minute in running, it's probably 130 beats per minute on the bike. So if you don't know that, and you do a fair amount of cycling as cross training, you're at risk of actually spending a lot of time at moderate intensity when you mean to be at low intensity. So so you can just sort of like, if you don't want to go through the bother, because you really, the only way to really dial it in, like scientifically, is to actually perform either lab testing or field testing to get a separate set of zones, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt and not necessarily what if you're a triathlete, absolutely, wow, totally worth it. But if you're a runner, I would go for, an RPE, or just like, if you're going from running to cycling, just take 10 beats per minute off of everything, 5 to 10.
Matt, do you find, and I've had some athletes sort of say this before, it's purely anecdotal, that sometimes people have a different experience of getting to those different heart rate thresholds on the bike versus on the run? So for example, I know some folks they go out for a jog, super easy pace, feels fine. They look down at their watch and they're at 130 beats per minute, feels easy no matter what. Whereas to get to 120, if you took 10 off on the bike, feels like it takes a lot more effort. Is that a common thing, or is that just a weird anecdotal thing I picked up on?
It is. I was reminded of it that there's an athlete I coach right now who he's a runner, and he got injured. I injure all my athletes. That's just what I do. So he started doing indoor cycling for cross training. And he was like, "Coach, my legs, like I can't get my heart rate up." And it's true that actually, even though you have an RPE in any aerobic activity, you can be cross country skiing, snowshoeing, rollerblading, whatever. And if I ask you, like, what is it?
Watching horror films is my cross training.
So if I ask you, what's your RPE out of one out of 10, you could give an answer. So, but that doesn't mean that, a 4 RPE on a bike is the same as a 4 RPE in running. And there's a fair amount of research showing like what goes into perceived effort, specifically in running versus cycling. And on the bike, it actually is much more muscle strain, like leg muscle strain. And in running, it's much more respiratory. Yeah. So yeah, like for me, I've been a triathlete and a runner forever. And also, even when I'm in running mode, I do a fair amount of cycling. So it doesn't really cross my mind. Like I've always got some residual cycling fitness, so I can go back and forth without a problem. But Roger, my athlete I was coaching, he was going from 0 on the bike, and he just felt like he was lifting weights with his legs. And in
that situation, Matt, would you then say, okay, like acclimate, spend the time? Yes, Roger, if your resting heart rate, or your low, not resting, if your low intensity heart rate at running is 130, you've got to get up to 115, 120 on the bike. Otherwise, it's not really worth it. Or would you say, no, if your perceived effort is comparable on the bike when you're at 100, stick with that? Like, would you force someone to adjust up to the beats per minute? Or would you say in that case to defer to perceived effort?
I kind of did a little bit of both, because he was actually an extreme case, and I wasn't super confident. I told him, like, you'll come out the other side of this. But I privately was in a little bit of doubt, just because of his self-reports just were a little bit extreme. But that is what ended up happening. So I would do it a little bit until he did come out the other side. I would certain types of workouts, like high intensity intervals, I would say hit the numbers. With something that was more sustained at low intensity on the bike, I told him just go, try to make it feel easy. And he early on he couldn't, no matter how slow he went, he was like, his legs gave out after 45 minutes or so. But he did in fact come out the other side of it, and now he's got another tool in his toolkit, and he's glad. Like even when he's healthy, but he wants to keep cycling in the mix, so it's always there for him. He doesn't want to like lose what he gained, and I think he's smart.
Yeah, and you can obviously rack up even more hours building aerobics, cycling, or doing cross training, just because there's much less strain on your body. Sometimes you'll watch the pros who have to take a couple months off, and they'll go heavy in the pool and come back in surprisingly good shape. Now they don't enjoy it; it doesn't sustain them, but you can make a lot of ground up in some ways if you are forcing yourself to do that cross training, just because the amount of hours you can spend building your aerobic base increases, because the damage you're doing to the rest of your body in that process is much lower. So if you can withstand the cross training, I'm coaching an athlete I used to coach, and I may be coaching again, who had also gotten injured doing a lot more running. We decided that if she gets back on the horse to train for something seriously, we're going to force her to do about 70% of her easy training. So of the training that's easy, which for her will be about 85% of her training, as it should be, 70% of that will have to be on the bike or the elliptical, at least for the first 5 or 6 months. And that's hard, because she's a runner, and runners want to run, and they don't want to be on the elliptical. They don't want to be on the bike. So, but if you're, again, this I think ties back into our theme of kind of planning for your year. If you're like, I want to crush Berlin next fall, and I'm going to do everything else in my year around crushing that, then yeah, maybe you decide to go all in on a lot more hours cross training for that. If you're like, I want to have a fun year running with a couple of events in there, here and there, then the idea of wasting or spending time is going to feel like wasting time if you're cross training. So it kind of varies, and do that kind of thing like that. And yeah, Carl, you're right that like folks who aren't used to cycling don't realize that they really can switch their gears and move their legs a lot quicker. You will turn over your legs a lot quicker doing easy stuff on the bike than you will turn them over doing easy stuff while you're running. So it can feel a little bit weird when you're getting on the bike. As a relatively new biker, I've adjusted to this notion that like, oh man, my cadence on the bike at 90 is going to feel like the leg speed I'm used to when I'm running a tempo, and that's not what I'm doing if I'm trying to go easy. So a really nice point there, Matt. As we think about a couple things, and I know we're just got a few more minutes here. Are there any things that you think as athletes think about planning for their year? Anything that most athletes probably aren't doing at the start of a year that they could start doing to make their year more successful?
I just finished writing an article for the Training Peaks blog that is kind of germane to that question. I think this is a really good time of year, assuming, was it Charlie and who's down under, like it's, they're heading into the completely opposite season we are, so it's different. But for us in the Northern Hemisphere, like this is a great time to experiment, actually. I mean, if you've taken time off and you just need to like start getting in shape again, well, okay, that should be your priority. But, I'll say this, and this is the way I lead off the article. I mentioned like, if you look at athletes who are able to perform at or near the very peak of their potential for an extended period of time, like Abdi Rahman, who qualified for 5 Olympic teams, like what's the secret for those people? It's consistency. If you look at like the Bernard Lagats or, the people who just are good for year after year after year, they're just, they have like one coach, they have one training system, and they just milk it. That being said, there is something to be said for tweaking the formula. So first you got to find a good formula, and then, sure, absolutely look for ways to refine and adjust. And there are certain adjustments you can make that are zero risk. And you can do those anytime, but there are others that, don't work for everyone or carry a little bit more risk. And this is the time of year to do that. Because like, if it doesn't work out, you've got plenty of time to like sort of undo whatever damage you did with a failed experiment and just go back to your old formula. But if it does work out, you have time to gain the full advantage of making that change. So a couple examples that I give of, experiments you might try around this time of year. One is, fasted workouts. So, selectively, a lot of people they want this to be like a magic wand and they want to do it every day. No, so selectively doing, certain workouts, intentionally in a carbohydrate depleted state. So give that a try. If it seems to work, then, it's one of those things where like, you're not going to get the full benefit from it in week 1 or week 2 or week 3. So, give it a try. If you like it, then you can make that something that you integrate into your periodization for the full season. Another one would be modifying your microcycle structure. So microcycle is basically a week. Most of us, like we have like a basic framework for our week. Like Tuesday is tempo day, Friday is intervals day, Sunday is long run day, whatever it is. If you want to say, like add a run, or maybe add 2 or add some cross training. So you're actually just, modifying, or you could actually go in the other direction. You could just decide, what, I'm tired of doubling. I want to see if I can do, longer, easy runs. That comes with a little bit of risk too. Like maybe 10 miles is a little too far for an easy run for you. So if you're gonna tweak your microcycle structure, this is a good time of year to try that experiment. And then another one would be, changing your form. And people who've read what I've written on form know that I'm not in favor of changing your stride for the sake of improving efficiency, because the science clearly says it actually has the opposite effect. But if you are getting recurrent injuries, then like a targeted, expert guided adjustment to your gait could be the way out of an injury hole. I'm one of them. Like, even though I'm dead set against just going from, heel striking to midfoot striking, just because I started when I was around Peter's age. I had an Achilles issue that I could not get over until I started running like Groucho Marx walks, like just kind of that seated sort of like sitting down and running thing. I just tried it on a whim. Like I had months of barely being able to run, and I tried that, and instantaneously I knew I was fixed. But it's very disruptive because you have to think about it every single stride you take. So if you're going to try something like that, you don't want to make the wrong change. So you should probably have an expert guiding you, and you want to do it when there's not a lot of pressure. Like you don't have a half marathon 5 weeks away and you're trying to adjust your stride. So I just thought I would toss that out there. It's probably not the usual answer to that question, and there are other answers I could give, but it is a good time to try experiments that have more than zero risk.
Groucho, go ahead.
I was going to add, I think you sort of touched on this strength training to that. People reach out to me. I have one YouTube video about my strength training routine, and people will then email me and say, hey, this looks awesome. I have my peak marathon in 7 weeks. Still 2 months out or so. Like, how should I get on board with this? And I'm like, I really would recommend that you start ramping up on this when it's low stakes. If you get in and you can hardly sit down because you blow your hamstrings, glutes, like then you can back off for 2 weeks and like just play around with it. But it is hard to get in that mindset when you're like 10 months out from your peak race. It's like a totally different life.
Yeah, I'll add to that to kind of combine what the both of you said. Like, if there's one thing that you want to do next year to get better at your racing, if you're not strength training, and that is sort of doing the right kind of core stuff and doing heavy lifting as a part of your strength training, start that now at the start of the year, especially if you don't have a big race coming up in the next 10 weeks. If you're not, if anything after Boston is probably okay to start that now. You really need to build that in to be a better version of yourself as a runner. That's absolutely key. And our pal Jason Fitzgerald, who runs strengthrunning.com, has great resources there. And I like his approach because he's like, I don't like to strength train. I like to run. I strength train because I have to, because I want to run. I think that's fair. You don't have to pretend that suddenly you want to be an Olympic weightlifter if you're getting into strength training. Not at all. You can really use it as a means to an end. So start that now. I'll also play around, to kind of add to some of what Matt said in terms of messing around with, the occasional fasted workout. Actually, let me ask you a quick question, Matt, before I tease a couple other things to experiment with. The fasted workouts thing is typically, for those who are unfamiliar with this notion, it's going, what is it, typically at least 12 to 14 hours without any carbohydrate intake before a run, and then kind of running a pretty long distance so that you intentionally deplete your body of carbs so it begins to burn fat, Matt. Generally, it's the kind of thing you want to do sporadically, very targeted as an approach. I've also heard a lot of folks talking about the notion where you can get a good amount of the benefit of that if you, let's say, eat dinner at 7 p.m. and do your run the next morning on an empty stomach every day. You do an hour of cross training. You're not going to go long enough typically most days to be fully depleted, but you can get some of the benefits of that if you kind of like went for that overnight stretch and run first thing without any carbs. Do you subscribe to that notion that you'll get comparable benefits if your sort of daily workouts are sort of pre-breakfast as opposed to the intentional true fasted run, let's say before a Sunday long run or something?
As far as I know, the latter hasn't been studied, but I have to think it's probably true. Whenever I write on this topic, I point out that in East Africa, that's what they do every single day. Like, they wake up, have a little tea with honey in it, and they'll actually do whatever their hardest run of the day is, like fasted every single day. And that's usually what I point out to people who try to make the point or make the case that it's like radical and crazy to do fasted workouts. I'm like, no, it's just waking up and running. But there are people who overuse it. The one thing I also like to point out is like, increasing fat burning capacity is not the main benefit of doing it. It's actually increasing aerobic capacity, because glycogen depletion in the working muscles is a trigger that upregulates genes that stimulate the adaptations that increase aerobic capacity. So increased fat burning capacity is a side story. It's actually, you're trying to increase your VO2 max by doing that. And there's some other, the scientists, they do stuff that you would never want to do in training, like 3 of these back to back to back in a week, like a hard interval session in the afternoon, a low carb dinner, wake up the next morning, run on a fasted stomach. Like the science shows it like a benefit, but it's like in a controlled study removed from the context of reality with no race on the horizon. So there are a few ways of skinning the cat there, and like the jury's a little bit out in terms of like, what is the best protocol, or like does something like you said work? I would think just intuitively that it does. So yeah,
makes sense. Yeah, and a lot of athletes certainly do it. So there's kind of cumulative anecdotal proof there. Speaking of fun things to play around with, Matt, I know this is something that I've asked you about before. I'm really curious about it as a topic. My memory is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think the last time you and I talked about this was actually like in Atlanta the week before COVID hit. But my memory is talking about high fat meals before long workouts. It was a Japanese cyclist study or something like that you were talking about how if you're not typically having a high fat meal before long performance, it can kind of trigger your body to be more efficient at burning fat or something like that. Is that something that, in addition to a fasted workout, folks who are interested in playing with something, maybe their long run routine, maybe talk a little bit about sort of that approach and what you know about it?
Yeah, that was one study. I think it was by Chinese researchers, and yeah, they just tested the idea of doing like a high fat breakfast before. I mean, the idea was like it was a pre-competition meal, though they were just a test. It was just a performance test, but they found an enhancement in performance. And it wasn't just like it's not like what's better, carbs or fat. No, they were just trying to find like a better formula. And the rationale was that if you've trained and then tapered, and then you're eating plenty of carbs normally, when you wake up on race morning, you only need about this much carbohydrate to top off your reserves. So like a high carb breakfast is actually overkill. But the thing that the high fat crowd misses is that one single meal, like if you have one high fat meal before exercise, it kind of flips a switch in your metabolism that causes your muscles to burn fat preferentially. So you don't have to have a high fat diet for months and months and months. You can just have one stinking meal. And if you go out and run afterwards, you're just going to rely a little bit more on fat than you would otherwise. So it wasn't like an all fat meal. It was like just enough carbs to top yourself off, but more fat to tell your body to start burning fat preferentially. It was just one study. I'm always reading the studies, and I thought, well, that seems worth a try, And so I started experimenting it with myself, not before workouts, but just before races. I tried it before a B race, just in case it blew up in my face. Because I'm like, what you have to eat to follow the protocol is like, you would think is a terrible idea, but it actually went fine. And then afterwards, with an N of 1, if you're getting a 1% benefit, you don't know. It's sort of like caffeine. So like I would just go back and forth. Maybe before that race where I talked to you, I think I did do the high fat.
You did. I know. We had the pancakes at the hotel.
Yeah. Well, that's high carbs. I didn't.
But no, you had a lot of syrup. Let's just put it this way. All I know is my fat only diet has not gotten me the results.
But I crushed it in Atlanta.
Couple of good
everyone
questions.
Go out and eat sausage before your race.
Oh yeah, what's an example of a good high fat meal the morning before a morning of a marathon race, Matt?
Well, I mean, you start to think about like what actually does it take, and I would just like do like the breakfast sandwiches without the bun. It's disgusting. But
you're allowed to also eat meat without a bun, Matt. Like you can have a steak. Like you can just do that. Like that's the thing people do sometimes.
Steak is mostly protein. Like syrup is mostly sugar. Steak is mostly protein. We need to have a little education on nutrition.
This is true. Well, I eat the fat part of the steak only. I leave the protein to the side. Great question from Pat B about heavy weights and marathon training. How much time do you need to recover from heavy weights before, like if you're factoring that into tapering for a run or something like that? How long before, let's say, a performance A race do you want to do your last heavy lift, Matt?
I'm not like the super expert, but I think, probably like, heavy. You should sort of taper down. When I'll say this, like when I was being coached by NAZ elite crew, and like, you know, even including my strength programming, it was out of my hands, was in the hands of an expert. I did my last strength workout like 4 days before the Chicago Marathon, but it was light, you know. So like if you're doing like the Olympic lifts or like heavy squats and stuff, I would say at least 10 days out.
I think my understanding, and our pal Jason would know this much better for sure, so we can follow up, Pat. But it generally with the heavy like Olympic level stuff or deep squats or something, you generally want it to parallel the rest of your training in terms of intensity and peaks like that. So like if you're in your 2-week taper, like from running, relatively speaking, you're probably going to be in the same sort of zone with heavy weights. But to Matt's point, like a little bit of light strength stuff, core stuff is a little bit more doable in terms of recovery. But yeah, Jason would be able to really give you a really specific answer for that relative to level. So we can hit him up for that. We're coming up on the end of time here. One thing I just wanted to mention for folks, I put this in the chat, but discount on gear and stuff is still good using the Endeavor Run code that's in the chat for those watching live. Definitely do that. That could be a fun thing to experiment with too. I was going to mention that in addition to that, like for those of you who like your gear, you like your watches, like your stuff like that, beginning of the year where there's not something coming up, you want to, what's it like to run with a Camelback? What's it like to, you know, carry this kind of bottle or something? This is a fun time to kind of try that stuff too. Especially for those here in the US, kind of in the winter funk in a lot of places. Experimenting with new gear is kind of a fun way to do that, especially if it's gear you think you might like to use for an ultra or, you know, do differently, or new kind of gels or something like that. Now is a good time to kind of see how your body reacts to some of the fun stuff to buy as well. I also want to quickly mention, just coming up, that we're going to be doing more of these at least once a month, if not more frequently. And Matt, you and I will probably announce that the topic for our next one coming up soon, but we'll probably do one at the end of January, maybe Wednesday. I think it's the 26th. I'll take a quick look here at my calendar just to confirm that I have remembered that correctly, but probably that Wednesday night we'll do one as well. And then Matt, maybe for the Winter Olympics, we'll do a couple of live watch sessions during some of the aerobic Winter Olympic events, biathlon, cross country, stuff like that. Talk about it in relation to running. I could watch biathlon all day. So that'll be for us to do as a group. We'll do some watch parties. We'll do some more of these. I know many of you who are here on the call are going to be joining us in Austin in mid-February for a running retreat. There'll be some injured folks like myself there. There'll be some folks who are going to be racing or at least running that weekend, folks who are hanging out. If you'd like to join us, please do. We still have some scholarships available for those who do need-based aid to make it there. Please write into us. There's a link in our Instagram bio and some of our newsletters about how to access scholarship applications for that. So far, everyone who's applied for a scholarship has received at least some aid to make it possible. So we're really thrilled about that because we'd love to have you there for that. And we're going to be doing some more events. So keep that in mind. But on behalf of myself, Matt, Peter, Coach B, the other folks at the helm of Endeavor Run, thanks to those joining this. Thanks to those of you who are watching this on replay or elsewhere. Really appreciate you guys being here. This will be the first of hopefully many more of these kind of fun, intimate, but still low-key evenings together. And if you have questions in the interim, like, you know how to find us. Being accessible is our favorite. You can reach out to us through the various platforms. That's why we do it. So it's great to have you guys here. Thanks so much for joining. Have a wonderful, safe, ideally relaxing New Year's, hopefully an Omicron-free New Year's and continuing next couple of weeks. Looks like that peak in the US here should ride out by mid to late January at the current rate. So hopefully for those joining in February, we'll be in good shape to be unmasked indoors. And obviously for Endeavor Run events, we always require full vaccination for things like that. So you have peace of mind there too. But thanks so much everyone for joining. It's great to see some familiar faces and appreciate you guys tuning in. And Matt, thanks again, as always, for the expertise and just bringing so much knowledge and good looks to the chat tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
You bet. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Thanks, guys.